So good morning, everyone. We do have everyone who registered to participate in person in the audience right now, and also people are present and listening, joining us on Zoom as well. I'm happy to welcome you to the Reluctant Decarbonization and Militant Petrostates workshop by Open Society Hub for the Politics of the Anthropocene. The opening word will actually go to Dr. Alexander Etkind, the head of the hub. I just wanted to mention that we are very happy to have you here. It is the first event of such scale for us, so we are very excited about it and are hoping to have very fruitful and interesting conversations today. A couple of moments more on administrative side. The Wi-Fi password, you can see a printout on that wall where you can find all the details, or alternatively come see me and I will share the password with you if you still don't have the access. The washrooms can be found when you exit from this hall to your left. All our coffee breaks and lunches are going to take place in the room behind the podium. Now we are going to start with the opening remarks by Dr. Alexander Etkind, and they will be immediately followed by his presentation. And I am Valeria Hesse. I am the research coordinator of the hub. I'm going to be moderating this panel, so prepare your questions. We have microphones in the audience to assist you with bringing up any questions or discussion points that you want. And to be faster and a little bit more efficient, I will encourage the speakers themselves to introduce themselves before they speak just briefly. And then we are going to proceed by first having the 4 speeches. After each speech, we will take a couple of questions directly to a particular speaker, and then we are going to have a little bit broader discussion with everyone participating and with the speakers who can possibly also pose questions to each other. And with that, I give the floor to Dr. Alexander Etkind, and I'm going to give you the mic.
Well, thank you very much, Valeria. And I'm really excited to start this event. This is our inaugural workshop. The Open Society Hub for the Politics of the Anthropocene. We are immensely grateful to the Open Society Foundation that supports our activities and will be supporting our work for several more years. For this inaugural workshop, we have chosen what we believe is the central subject of this field. Basically, our task is to structure the field politics of the Anthropocene. So broad, so new. In fact, it is new. And demarcation of this field is our task. So the reluctant decarbonization and militant petrostates. Political scientists call it the oil curse, economists call it the Dutch disease, and anthropologists call it extractivism. Here we are, an interdisciplinary group of scholars led by historians, and we call it the petrostate, which emphasizes the interaction between the natural resource and the political institution. This is why we're talking about the petrostate in belief that it is coming to be the central issue and the central problem of the field. A huge scholarly literature, hundreds of studies, has proven that exporting carbon fuel is related to dictatorship, corruption, and aggression. Another much bigger stream of literature, thousands of studies, demonstrates that burning carbon fuel leads to climate crisis. These are arguably two biggest stories of our time. Amazingly, they have been rarely told together. But these stories are connected like two sides of the moon, or rather like the two poles of the vicious circle. The oil curse is bad enough, but emissions make it worse. And the reverse is also true. The climate crisis has been amplified by the political behavior of the petrostates. So this is basically the thesis that I will be trying to unfold right now. So two sides of the moon, or two poles of this vicious circle. One of them is political. And this phase is not new at all. This is basically that side of the moon that has been always looking at us. In the great stories about oil that span from John Rockefeller to the Koch brothers to Vladimir Putin, this political phase has been turned to humanity. Talking about the empirical proof, the pioneer in this field is Jeff Colgan, the political scientist from Brown University, who has demonstrated that in our century, petroaggression, as he calls that, was the most common type of military conflict around the world. The petrostates launch wars more often than other countries, and their military conflicts are longer than others. Colgan published his study in 2021. And the wars that have occurred since that study have confirmed the effect. Russia is a petrostate and Azerbaijan too. Venezuela is a classical petrostate. Iran and Qatar, two petrostates, have been financing Hamas and the Houthis for decades. A small but super active part of the international community, the petrostates are the main source of global energy, regional wars, and aggressive authoritarianism. There is also the ecological side of fossil fuels, the other side of the moon, which of course we are experiencing on our skin very recently. Burning fossil fuels is a major source of climate change, and everyone knows it now. It has been somehow less understood that when we burn oil and produce emissions, this oil, and to some extent these emissions, mostly comes from abroad. Extended to OPEC Plus in 2016, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries now boasts 23 members, including the belligerent Russia. It is highly meaningful that E in OPEC stands for exporting and not for extracting. The petrostate is defined not by extraction of fossil fuel, but by its export. This is one of the reasons why coal, as it was demonstrated some time ago by Timothy Mitchell, has different political qualities than oil. Most of the global coal is burned domestically. Most of the global oil is exported to be burned elsewhere. Now, for the planetary atmosphere, of course, it doesn't make any difference whether carbon is burned close or far from the place of origin. For national politics and international relations, it is a fact of huge importance. Political economy connects oil revenues to the large government. Due to its carbon export, petrostates and their governments do not depend on the labor, prosperity, and votes of their people. Michael Ross, another political scientist, demonstrated that oil wealth leads to the proliferation of bureaucracy, secrecy, corruption, and inequality. This is why the petrostate is connected to dictatorship. Only exported oil gives super profits that allow the dictator to prosper despite his corrupted elites, impoverished subjects, and senseless wars. Most of the global oil is extracted and exported by the states and not by private entrepreneurs. The time of oil barons is over. Now, this is the time of oil sultans. Some of them are actually sultans, but many are not. When it comes to consuming this oil, however, the situation is opposite. Most of global oil is burned and used by private entities, including you and me. This planetary metabolism is enormous, but it is not that complex. Products of nature are exchanged for products of labor, which are used for exploiting nature, and the circle continues. Two types of political economy stand on the different sides of this exchange. One is the state-centered and monopolistic economy of oil, and another still practices competition and creative labor. This situation is not that complex, but is very dynamic. Capitalism needs growth, and nothing secures this growth better than oil. However, and this is the news of the last decades, the only way to battle climate change is decarbonization, which reduces the use of oil and other fossil fuels. With this way, indeed, we are landing on the moon. In other words, we are coming to the core of our problem. The European Union plans to halve the greenhouse emissions by 2030 and to end them by 2050 actually mean that Russia, Norway, Algeria, and 20 more countries would be losing the same share of their profits, would be losing a half of their profits by 2030 and almost all of their petrodollars by 2050. While the European leaders and other consumers think about decarbonization as a common cause, because it is our common atmosphere, a planetary value, petrostates see decarbonization as a zero-sum game in which someone gains and they lose. Or in some cases, it is even worse. They see the situation as a conspiracy aimed at depriving them, the petrostates, of their essential profits. Despite our planetary interests, which is definitely there, the truth is that decarbonization has been a divisive factor in global politics. Under the pressure of decarbonization and being fully informed about the current plans, projects, and already laws, for instance, the laws that were voted by the European Parliament in 2021. Under this pressure, petrostates see the reduction of their exports as a security threat. These are the statehood that existentially depend on this particular business, on this particular trade. And reducing this trade is a security threat. This is why a typical war of the last 30 years has been a war between a petrostate and its neighbor, with the US and EU interfering at some later stage. Sometimes a petrostate starts such a war against a neighboring country because this neighboring country, this adjacent land, also has oil. And the task is to enlarge the reserves. But much more often, a petrostate starts a war against a neighbor that transports its oil, because delivery routes are even more important for a petrostate than oil reserves. The literature on petroaggression, say Colgan's and others' work, does not differentiate between these two types of oil wars. In the last decades, we've seen them both. Wars for delivery routes on land and sea. Examples are Russia versus Ukraine, Russia versus Georgia, Azerbaijan versus Armenia, the dark story of Nord Stream, the Western coalition against Yemen and Iran. And on the other hand, wars for oil assets, such as the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the declared intention of Venezuela to capture Guyana. Finally, in the Gaza conflict, we see the combination of many types and motivations for war. But this transit war, or the war for delivery routes, is much more frequent. In fact, it is a typical war of petroaggression, more frequent than the war for the additional reserves. Reading newspapers, we constantly learn about the seaborne transportation of oil through the hotspots such as the Suez Canal, Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, Danish Straits, Nord Streams 1 and 2, etc. And all these sea routes are the sites of maritime conflicts nowadays. However, more than a half of global oil is transported by land, by pipelines, railways, or even in trucks. And unlike the sea, there is no state on the sea. On the firm land, there are states. I call them transit states. For this half oil that is transported terrestrially, there is usually a transit state that separates the petrostate and the consumer. Examples are Georgia and Ukraine for Russia, or Armenia and Georgia for Azerbaijan. Some European countries, such as Austria, Hungary, or Slovakia, are also transit hubs for Russian oil and gas. Charging money for transportation, these transit states are necessary partners of petrostates. Relying on these transit fees, these countries experience the oil curse by proxy. But this is not a traditional dependency of the colonial state on its imperial master, because a transit state has an unusual power to block the oil and gas trade. And it is an existential threat for a petrostate. This is why a war for annexing the transit state is a particular and frequent type of petroaggression, more common than a war for the foreign oil fields. Seaborne trade does not know this problem because there are no states on high seas. Transit war is typical for terrestrial petrostates such as Russia, its neighbors in the Caucasus, and for the landlocked petrostates in Africa. And once again, this is the crucial context for understanding the Russo-Ukrainian war. I believe that there are some policy implications that are coming from this understanding. Let's look at the emission trading schemes, ETS, as they work in the European Union and California, and they plan to work in China. In all cases, ETS, the emission trading scheme, it's a massive market with billions of euros or dollars kind of rotating there. In all cases, ETS attributes emissions to the country in which fossil fuel is burned, and not to the country from which it had come. So where, I'm driving my car here in Austria, I am burning the oil which came from Norway or Algeria or elsewhere. And the emissions from my car, they are counted as the Austrian emissions, not the Algerian emissions or Norwegian emissions. Developing in the oil-consuming parts of the world, such as the European Union, the US, and China, the cap-and-trade schemes do not embrace the petrostates who supply these countries with fuel. And look, there is no moral or ecological justification for this practice. If the world were just, petrostates would have carried the burden of the green transition along with the consumers of their oil, so that the emissions and all the charges for emissions and all the statistics of emissions would be the responsibility for emissions would be divided between the supplier of the fuel and the consumer of the fuel in the proportion that economists would find very, very easy to calculate. Why it has not happened? Probably because it would increase the price of petrol in the gas stations. So I would pay more for my charge. And this is the nightmare of the current generations of politicians. Joe Biden had just started his service in the American Senate when the oil shock of 1973 happened. Emmanuel Macron had his lesson when Yellow Vests rebelled in Paris in 2018. When Ukraine attacked Russian refineries, the American and European allies were trying to stop these attacks because of the fear of the increasing oil prices. So just to give you some kind of financial reality of this, when used, a barrel of oil emits about half ton of greenhouse gas. So 1 barrel of oil produces half ton of gases. For this amount of emissions, the consumers pay about $60 in Europe. And of course, they pay these emission fees on the top of $80 that they had already paid for every barrel to the supplier of this barrel, to Norway, Nigeria, or Russia, etc. And those who export oil and take part in the overall profits do not pay for the emissions that their oil produces abroad. Citizens of the oil-consuming states and corporations of the oil-consuming, oil-burning states pay for these emissions. And for petrostates, their part is free of charge. It's like a petro privilege of a sort. This accounting emphasizes the responsibility of the buyer, denies that of the seller, and it is really counterintuitive because it would actually be understandable if this oil would be taken for free, like from a colony. The imperial state is taking this resource from a colony for free, or if a thief takes this property for free and then uses it for some harmful purposes. And then this thief is fully responsible for the harm because he took it for free, he didn't pay. But this oil had been bought for free market prices on the internationally recognized contracts. The emissions are the common products of the petrostates and the consuming states, the result of mutually profitable collaboration, a co-authorship. Like for our academic minds, I would use this method. Our world would be certainly different and arguably a better place if petrostates started co-paying for the emissions that their main product oil produces in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opening speech, and I apologize for the outbursts. I have a random allergy all of a sudden, so excuse me. Well, do we have questions, immediate questions in the audience? If you're thinking for the moment, then I have my first question to you. So you ended on the note that actually the interaction between the supplier state and consumer state is a mutually profitable collaboration between them, and therefore they need to start, co-paying for the carbon emissions, or like making their inputs in reducing carbon emissions as well. So how could you see the first steps in these directions, and like what is the discussion on this now, if there is one? Is there any progress on that?
Well, very, very fair question, but also very, very difficult question. But I did promise you policy implications, so I should basically try to respond. But first, we should understand the scale of this change, of the proposed change. It's tectonic. It's massive. It's huge. The whole system, say in Europe, of these emission trading schemes, they are massive. That took lots and lots of effort to institute this, and many years until it was it has started working full scale. So basically, that would have to change. Of course, so the first start, of course, is a scholarly polemic on the subject. Frankly, I'm surprised that we don't have it. If we do have it, there are people who will correct me, and I would be grateful. But of course, scholarly polemics is the first step. Whatever the economic calculation is the second step, and then massive political decisions would be needed. Why it is not happening, I think I mentioned that would necessarily lead to the increase of petrol prices, which is a major political issue, and as I also mentioned, a major fear of the current generations of our leaders. I think that this fear is unsubstantiated. We have nothing to fear but fear itself in this respect. And oil prices and petrol prices should go up, up, up. This is the way for the future. This is the way to battle climate change. But that would be the last step, not the first step, but the last step in this sequence.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I see that Aleh had an immediate reaction. There is a microphone on your table as well. Just
no, Alexander. I think in the sort of spirit of scholarly debate, I was very impressed by your speech, and you wrote it before, and most impressed by your policy proposal. But let's say, just sort of for simplicity, we are not economists here, but let's say we have a gasoline station there, right? And somebody is selling cheap gasoline, but every time I buy it, I have to pay to the state the tax. It becomes expensive for me. And what you're proposing that no, it's not me who should pay the tax, it's a person who is selling me, right? The petrostate. Boss. Okay. Well, let's start for simplicity, just for them paying something, right? Well, and let's say they're in another country also, right? So that's easy. So what is the difference? Well, the difference, first of all, the price of gasoline becomes expensive in both cases. It's already expensive in Europe because we already pay these prices, right? So if we shifted them to Saudi or to Russia, it wouldn't be more expensive, right? They will be paid on the other side. Now, that's very good. As you said, the price becomes expensive, then I buy myself an electric car. It doesn't matter who pays the tax. The gasoline on me becomes expensive, I buy myself electric car. So that's very good. So what is the difference? They would say it doesn't matter who pays the tax, it's just a matter of collection. It does actually matter, because if the gas station is in another country, if I pay the tax, it gets to my Swedish government, right? If they pay the tax, it gets to the Russian government, right? Unless you persuade Russia to give money to Sweden, right? Which they collect from the states. So economically, I think that the effect on decarbonization will be the same, right? If you pay, and the difference will be that the money will stay in petrostates instead of, staying in the European Union. Well, now you clarified that you think that they both should pay, right? Well, once again, why not ask us to pay twice as much? Will be more money for our governments to support decarbonization, and gasoline will be more expensive for us to switch to electric cars or not drive or whatever, or take buses or whatever else, or bikes. So like the economic logic of it kind of eludes me a little bit. And then another thing which I have much less, you said that we need to achieve very high oil prices. And I'm of two minds on this. And here I'm clearly on two minds, because like when we achieve very high oil prices, basically Russia celebrates. And the higher the oil prices, the more they celebrate. And Saudi, right? So it's kind of, once again, maybe we need an economist on our team to think whether we need very high oil prices or whether we need like a little bit lower oil prices at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Alexander, did you want to react, or should we move forward?
Well, we're at risk of going into technicalities, but of course, tax is just a part of the price. So the price goes to corporations including petrostate in the emission trading scheme is a revolutionary step, which also needs some kind of global governance over it. So the taxes should go over there to that institution that would oversee it and implement it, and also control the possible violations of these emission regimes. And of course, we don't have such power. So this is a utopian proposal. I agree with that, with you, but I think that's the time for discussing its, pros and cons.
pretty happy about it. Very simple. Just forward, backward.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Valeria. Thank you very much, Professor Etkind and Valeria and everyone else for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Naosuke Mukoyama. I'm based in Japan at the University of Tokyo, and my affiliation with this institute called the Institute for Future Initiatives. It sounds dodgy, I know. It sounds, I don't know. I don't exactly like the name, but that's where I am. And I don't really do much about the future. I'm very much stuck in the past. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about sort of the origins of petrostates, and rather than speaking directly about decarbonization, I talk about the process of carbonization in history. So I'm gonna talk a bit about the relationship between colonial oil and the origins of petrostates. Sorry for abusing this opportunity for myself, shameless self-promotion, but I recently published this book called Fueling Sovereignty from Cambridge University Press. It's been just a few months, so I think it's pretty new, and I think this is the first time I speak about the book outside of Japan in front of audience. So the book is about a theoretical and historical study of how colonial oil politics created some of the most unlikely states that were not supposed to exist, but they happened to become states. So the question I'm answering here is why did some colonies achieve statehood individually, while others did not and became part of a larger entity? And I answer this question by with two factors. The first one is colonial oil production, and the second one is a specific colonial administration system, what I call the protectorate system. So the big question I have here is this one: why do states exist in the present territorial form? So, for example, if you look at the map on the left-hand side, you can see Pacific islands, and there are hundreds of islands in the Pacific Ocean, but they are divided somehow into a certain number of countries. And there is nothing natural about the division of these islands into these specific countries. And if you look at the borders, they are quite linear and they look quite arbitrarily. So why did they have to be divided into certain number of states rather than any other possible territorial forms? And you can say pretty much the same thing about any other regions, including here the island of Borneo or the Persian Gulf. But these are just some examples, and I think you could ask the same kind of question to any possible region, any possible area. So when you think about the formation of states, you should probably look at the period of colonization and decolonization. And this graph shows the number of colonial entities over time. And the periods colored in blue are the periods of colonization and decolonization. You can see that the number of colonies increased rapidly in the latter half of the 19th century and early 20th century. This was the period of new imperialism. European colonial empires competed with each other to put the rest of the world into their spheres of influence, their colonial empires. And the number stayed around the same at 700 for a few decades. And then the number declined sharply after World War II. And let's think about the relationship between colonialism and natural resources. And you would immediately notice that natural resources were a driver of colonial expansion. And you can start with the case of Spanish exploitation of silver in Peru and Bolivia. And you can also think about the British Navy's shift from coal to oil just before the World War I, which prompted their expansion into the Middle East. And another example is phosphate depletion in Nauru by Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, which took over the German colony after World War I. So they sort of depleted the phosphate resources in Nauru, reducing Nauru into one of the poorest countries in the world soon after their independence. And this relationship between colonialism and natural resources, you could say that this started at the very beginning of colonialism, which is Christopher Columbus, traveling to the New World, and one of his motives was to find gold in the New World. So, if you reach this point, you could think that if natural resources were important in colonization, then they might have been important in decolonization as well. So I asked this question: what kind of impact did natural resources have on the creation of states? And would the world map of states look different if it were not for natural resources? And how would that be different? That's the question I'm tackling here. And then I went back to this graph and noticed that there used to be 700 colonies. Now we have about 100. So 600 colonies ceased to exist. But as a result, we only have 150 states. So what happened here is basically there was a significant territorial reorganization, and more specifically, there were quite a lot of cases of merger of colonial entities. And because the colonial powers or regional powers promoted merger, they were afraid of creating a bunch of different small quasi-states that could destabilize the international society. So they created federations in Central Africa, West Indies, or South Arabia, etc. And there were also cases of annexation by neighbors. And then, because of these merger projects by the colonial power, the strong colonial powers or regional powers, most small colonies included in a merger project were actually merged into a larger entity, federations usually, but some rejected a merger and achieved independence separately from the merger project. So I'm trying to figure out why this happened. And then finally, I noticed that there is something about oil states, petrostates. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a list of cases of what I call separate independence separately, even when a colony was included in a merger project. And you would notice that on this list, there is a high proportion of petrostates. There are not that many petrostates in the world, but on this list, almost half of the countries on the list are petrostates. So Brunei in Southeast Asia, which rejected Malaysia, Qatar, Bahrain, which rejected the UAE, Kuwait, which maintained independence despite the threat by Iraq, and Trinidad and Tobago, which broke away from the West Indies Federation. So I thought, there must be some connection between oil and the creation of states, oil and separate independence. So I looked into this, and I reached this argument, which is that the colonial politics of oil created states that would otherwise not exist. And more specifically, when faced with the project for amalgamation, two factors contributed to separate independence. One is pre-independence oil production, which is oil production that substantially preceded decolonization in big enough quantities. And the second factor was what I call the protectorate system, which you could think of this as something similar to what we call indirect rule. So it's a colonial rule, but it's through a local ruler with significant power, and the ruler gets protection from the colonizers. So when these two conditions are met, a colony becomes an independent state rather than becoming part of a larger entity. And then that means the birth of certain petrostates that we have today, like Qatar and Bahrain and Brunei in Southeast Asia. So how does this actually happen? In this hypothetical scenario in which one colony, a ruler of the colony decides between a merger and a separate independence, that you have to calculate the pros and cons of both options, and there are quite a lot of benefits of merger. Because if you're part of a bigger country, then it usually means better security because you have more military sources, and as well as economic resources as well. So there's this scale of merit working here. And in the case of colonies that we are talking about, merger was also the metropole's preferred option, so it was difficult to reject it. On the other hand, there is also a merit of becoming independent on your own because you get more autonomy. The larger the country becomes, the more people who are dissatisfied with the central government. So keeping your country small is for your benefit because you can decide on your own policies rather than having someone else decide for you. So there are merits and pros and cons of both merger and separate independence. But what oil and the protectorate system did in the decolonization process was to reduce the merits of merger and increase the merits of independence. So that's how oil actually created certain states that would otherwise not exist. And this is a little complicated, but the causal mechanism of this independence oil-led creation of states is like this. I consider that there are three sort of conditions for statehood. And the first one is incentive. You need to have an incentive to become independent, right? Because that's not even an option preferred by the colonizers. But oil and the protectorate system provide this incentive because if you have a lot of oil, you don't want to share your wealth with your neighbors. So you don't want to join a bigger entity and share your wealth with other neighbors. And because you are a ruler of a separate entity, you don't want to become part of a larger entity and become one of many rulers in the new bigger country. And the second condition is what I call viability, meaning that just wanting to become independent is not enough. You have to make sure that this is a possible option. And oil, again, provides financial security, financial self-sufficiency. And if you produce a lot of oil, you can sort of get protection from certain Western states. And because of the protectorate system, because of the colonial link with Western power, you can also get a security guarantee from that power, increasing the viability of your colonial entity as a state. And then the third condition is bargaining power. If you produce a lot of oil, then you are in a stronger position in the negotiation for independence, because the stable supply of oil is crucial for the colonizers that we are talking about. And the protectorate system ensures that there is a local ruler who has a significant amount of power. Then the ruler can decide on the future of his territory rather than having the colonizers decide for him. So the result is separate independence. Sorry, I'm kind of going through all of this really fast. If you have any questions later, you can always ask me. But that's how certain petrostates came to exist. And I've been always wondering, why many petrostates are that small. Qatar is and Bahrain is one of the smallest countries in the world. So is Qatar, so is Brunei in Southeast Asia. So I kind of found the reason that they exist precisely because they produced oil during the colonial period. And so what I did in the book is to look at different kinds of cases in two regional settings in Southeast Asia on the island of Borneo, as well as the Persian Gulf. And I first did some within case analysis on the three main cases I have, Brunei, Qatar, and Bahrain. And based on some archival materials I got from the British National Archives. And then I compared these cases with their neighbors. So I sort of classified cases into four categories depending on the two explanatory factors that I have: oil and the protectorate system. And I compared Brunei with 3 other colonial entities on the island of Borneo, and then Qatar and Bahrain with another Gulf sheikhdom called Ras Al Khaimah. So that's what I did in the book. So the main cases are Borneo and the lower Gulf. And then I looked at some other regional contexts, including Kuwait, West Indies, and South Arabia. And in the last empirical chapter, I also talked about different natural resources, not just oil, but coal, natural gas, or precious metals in the book. So these are the 2 regional settings I'm talking about: Borneo and Persian Gulf. So in Borneo, I compared 4 different colonial entities: Brunei, North Borneo, Sarawak, Dutch Borneo. 3 of them became part of a larger entity, Malaysia or Indonesia, but Brunei became independent as a separate entity. So I'm asking why, and I explained this with the 2 factors I talked about. And in the Persian Gulf, there were 9 sheikdoms, 7 of which became the part of the UAE, but Qatar and Bahrain became independent separately. So I'm explaining why this happened. And in the last chapter, I talk about the different effects of natural resources, and I kind of classify natural resources into 4 categories depending on the value of the resource and the timing of the discovery of that resource. And if a natural resource is not valuable enough, then it doesn't really affect any territorial outcomes in the state formation process. But if it's valuable, there are 3 different possible effects depending on the timing of discovery relative to colonization and decolonization. And if the resource is found during the process or before colonization, then it leads to merger or amalgamation, and which one of an example of which is precious metals in Spanish America. And when it's found between colonization and decolonization, it could lead to independence, as I have just explained. So one of the examples is oil. And when it's found after decolonization, then it leads to secessionism from an existing sovereign state, not independence itself, but it's a movement for independence, a case of which is natural gas. So yeah, I look at different kinds of natural resources after discussing oil, and that's basically what I did and what I'm currently doing. Yeah, sorry for going over everything really fast, but this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm now wondering if we have any questions from the audience at this point. Okay, Dr. Etkind.
So your whatever was the islands, states, subject with the does that make a difference in your scheme of things? One, but still that is a population. It's not done. So that's just share some part. If they have a group of stuff. Share.
Alexander, for the great questions. Yeah, I think I found your point about terrestrial states being, sort of vulnerable to blockade by a transit state. I found it really fascinating, and that made me think about the terrestrial states versus islands or peninsulas. I didn't choose the cases because they are islands or on the peninsula per se, but I think I ended up having those cases. And I think terrestrial states, if say Russia, US, Canada, these states. I'm looking at the colonial period that gave birth to certain formerly colonized states. So I didn't intentionally choose these cases, but I didn't come across terrestrial states that were formerly colonized by European states that produce oil and had the protectorate system. So somehow, I didn't really include this kind of discussion in the book, but yeah, no, I think it would have been quite difficult if it's landlocked to export oil to the metropole, unless it's geographically pretty close to the metropole. So if you need to secure the route to export oil to the metropole, so it's probably easier for the colonizers to develop oil on the island or on the coastal areas. So that might be the reason why I didn't come across any cases of petro colonies that became independent separately in the terrestrial areas. I think that's something I just came up with, but your question made me think about it. And about the population, you're right. I think the ruler still has to please the population in certain ways, and rulers of Brunei or Qatar, Bahrain, they actually do in many ways. They provide jobs in the government sectors, or they provide social welfare. Some of them don't have income tax, or they provide gas for free, things like that. So they do try to make sure that people are happy with the regime. This is sort of one of the mechanisms that Michael Ross in his article talked about. There were 3 different mechanisms that petrostates use to ensure they will remain in power. But those mechanisms are very much functioning in these countries. And also, if you keep your country as small as possible, that means there are fewer people you have to please. So you can sort of minimize the cost of spending on people's welfare if you keep your country small. So that's one of the merits of creating those small countries. Having said that, I found it quite surprising when I traveled to Brunei that despite the richness of the country, of the royal family, basically, the country itself is seemed quite underdeveloped. There was no proper, if you imagine something like Dubai or Doha, that's not something you find in Brunei. So that makes me wonder how the finance is going on in the country. But it's not that easy to look at what's exactly going on in those countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any immediate questions? Okay, John, please. Wait for the mic just a second.
Thank you. I have a question about the multinational companies in that story. Do they have any role in this creation of states? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, that's a fascinating question as well. Well, in the case of Brunei, for example, Brunei Shell, which was partly owned by the British government, was the operating company in Brunei, and it did lobby the British government to sort of provide more security to Brunei, make sure that Brunei gets what it wanted, because they were successful in building a friendly relationship with the Bruneian ruler. So they wanted to have that relationship going on for as long as possible. So it did actually help Brunei become secure independence rather than joining Malaysia. And I'm pretty sure something like that happened in other colonies as well.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Okay, then I would suggest we move to our next speaker, who is Aleh Cherp. I'm gonna share the presentation in a moment. And the clicker should be somewhere there. Just get directed in. If you could use the mic, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
It like feels that CEU is finally here, after Budapest and all of this, that we are regaining this spirit of, academic debate and interesting events here. So, I would like to talk about petrostates, and I myself study decarbonization. I also work at CEU here. I'm currently on sabbatical. I also work in Lund University in Sweden, and my co-author is Anastasia Pavlenko from here in CEU. So what I do, I work in a small research group that basically researches an interesting subject, which I think is interesting, is the feasibility of saving the climate. We ask the question, okay, well, how can we in real world save the climate, where it will get us? And to do that, we study the change in energy systems. And very much like you, we mostly study the change in the past, because to learn about very long-term future, you have to study the past. But then we have some interesting methods of how, we project it in the future. And that also means that my talk will be slightly disciplinary different from, maybe the rest here. I'm not a historian, not an international relations scholar. I'm like pretty close to an engineer, but I call myself a social scientist. And then, I apologize if you will see too many numbers here, but I'll try to make it palatable. So what we study is, once again, we try to conceptualize things such as energy security, feasibility of climate action, stuff like that. But we also study very concrete systems. We did a lot of research on coal, because that's the biggest problem with climate. And we did quite a lot of research on renewable, and even more on nuclear power. And now we are going into CCS and hydrogen. So that is not really research about petrostates. So when I was asked to talk about it, I just asked, well, what is the problem, first of all? And then there is some problem. Some people do say that, well, petrostates, they are like super bad, and they slow down decarbonization. But then you ask as a scientist, so what is scientific evidence that they slow decarbonization? And there is this iconic paper, which basically says, well, it's written by 40 or so like very important people. And it basically asks, why are we still not reducing emissions? Everybody knows that climate change is bad. It's 30 years we've been talking about it. Why they are not reduced? So, and it lists all sorts of reasons, from like mental reasons to like very deep economic and cultural and philosophical. And I wanted to see whether it says anything about petrostates. And it does say in one point that Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, that they are very notorious in disrupting climate, negotiations globally. So I decided to trace it. How do they know that they're notorious? I traced one reference, which was to another reference of a journalistic article in The Independent. So what the article said, that actually these very bad petrostates, at one meeting, they wanted not to welcome one of the IPCC special reports, but to take note of it, right? And then that was considered as notorious widespread destruction of like global agenda. I didn't think it's enough evidence, so I decided, well, let's look at the numbers. What do they do? What it is so bad? And the way I structure this presentation, I'm going to ask 3 questions. Do they really slow decarbonization? If so, why? And what can be done about it? Let's get to the first question. Even before that, we need to know what a petrostate is. I think we have intuitively know, but maybe just the definition will actually give different answers to this question. So let's see how people define petrostate. In our studies, we define petrostate by looking for some sort of how the exports are structured. or like exactly as you say, Alexander, you know, the exports are important. We define a petrostates usually when the exports are more than 30% of energy supply, so that they export a lot of energy, more than they consume. Sometimes we measure what is share of fuel in the overall exports. That gives a different number of states. Colgan, of course, defines it as GDP is more than 10% of fossils. And then there is Carbon Action Tracker, which does definition, which defines that the share of government revenues is more than 5%. Well, now, these categories, they overlap quite a lot. Like our category is pretty narrow. Here, what we say major exporters, Colgan is a little bit more expensive. Carbon Tracker is generally even more expensive. But as you can see, the differences are mostly in smaller countries. So you will see that the overall picture will be roughly the same for all of them. So now let's look at them and let's ask the big question. Let's ask, what are the carbon emissions of these petrostates? Are they going up? Are they going down? Staying the same? What is the proportion? And here we discover something super boring, that the share of global emissions from petrostates, whichever way you define it, is kind of not very remarkable. It's not very small, not very remarkable, but it doesn't really change since the fall of the Soviet Union. And then you say, well, nothing changes. Well, no, things change. Like in China, the share of global emissions shoots up. In OECD, it goes down, both in absolute and relative number, but petrostates are kind of, you know, more or less the same. So it's not the emissions here, probably, which they kind of, you know, do something wrong. And here I go to the more to the core of our research. Here comes something maybe a little bit complicated as a graph. What it shows how countries adopt wind power and solar power. On the left, wind power, on the right, solar power. And under the line, you see how many countries don't have wind and solar power, and over the line, how many countries already introduced them. And it goes from whatever, 1990 to 2020. And here we divide countries in different groups. And here you see our favorite petrostates. Here we define them as non-OECD exporters. So what you see that at least when we published these papers, there was no petrostate that had any wind or solar power of any significant number, which is pretty, you know, remarkable, because these are big and developed economies. So why not? And I thought that is maybe. And then we started discussion why. I'll get to this. And then when we studied nuclear, we saw more or less exactly the same, even though there was a different category of petrostates. Petrostates normally, by their size and how fast they grow, they should have nuclear, and it very rarely happens. There is an increasing number of major exporters that don't introduce nuclear power. So they are not super good in introducing low carbon technologies. Now, why, you might ask, but once again, we answer this in a second. Another state also that we discovered from our research, which they stand out, they actually contain the majority of global fossil fuel subsidies, which is considered by IPCC one of the biggest problems preventing now our shift of climate change. So if we take all fossil fuel subsidies in the world, the majority of them would fall into these countries, which are definitely not majority of population or economies, in Middle East, Russia with this thing, which includes Kazakhstan and, you know, Turkmenistan, etc., and Latin American region, which also exports a lot of fuels. So fossil fuel subsidies are there, and there is low, not so much low carbon economies. Now we can ask why. Why? What is in these countries? And of course, the first kind of thing is that, exactly as Alexander said, that they think that their revenues will fall because of decarbonization. And indeed, if you look at the International Energy Agency published a special report on what happens with, you know, oil and gas if we move towards climate change. And if we do policies as now, nothing will happen. It will be steady. But if you do policies which we already promised to do, maybe yes or no, who knows, there will be quite significant decline. And if we move to something which is called net zero, when we commit to not having any emissions from energy systems by 2050, then there will be even faster decline. Here is oil, and here is, according to the IEA, here is natural gas. So there will be this decline, and that of course means decline of revenues. Now, the Carbon Tracker published this excellent report, which shows how much government revenues will be affected by this. This is so-called APS, the announced pledges scenario. That's in the middle of the IEA scenarios, policies which we promised, maybe do, maybe not. And you can see that they are differently affected because the governments of these countries have different share of fossil revenues in government budgets, but also when you do decarbonization, they will be affected differently. There will be some countries which will be selling oil anyway, whatever you do, because they always so cheap. And there will be some countries who will need, for example, Nigeria, who will need to reduce. So that there is clear risk to them, right, of this decline. But still, why won't they develop low carbon technologies? Actually, low carbon technologies would probably help them to reduce this risk. Look at what Equinor does. Equinor is a new name for Statoil of Norway, right? That they are now the leaders in making this extremely complex technology of offshore wind, right? Very clearly that they will earn money and they will take a new niche in the future world. Now, moreover, if they introduce low carbon technology like nuclear, which is recently introduced in United Arab Emirates, or world biggest solar farms in Saudi Arabia, they reduce the domestic consumption of fossils and can export more, so that they reduce the risk. They actually increase, their income, and they also diversify. So the question is probably not that they don't want it. There is something else. Well, then, because, before I do that, I just want to also tell you like one thing which we kind of also discovered through our research. And that is that actually not only they kind of, are interested in low carbon, sometimes they succeed. And the case in question is Russia and nuclear power. Russia traditionally, historically dominated nuclear power in Eastern Europe. So it supplied most of nuclear power in Eastern Europe, which was probably, geopolitical Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, etc. But then what is very interesting that it retained its domination, not only in Eastern Europe, but also in the world. We actually did a network analysis of all agreements on nuclear between different countries, which involve supply of equipment. And Russia far dominates these agreements. So it's the biggest nuclear player, at least before the war, it was in the war, supplying nuclear equipment to many countries. And of course, it is understandable. They want to diversify, they want to produce different revenues, and they have their geopolitical reasons. So the question is still, why not? Why are they generally, forget this Russian story like Saudi Arabia Solar, why generally they are behind? And the obvious answer to me are exactly these subsidies, which I already mentioned. If you look how much electricity costs in petrostates or how much gasoline costs, this is just very easy to obtain. You can see that they are much, much cheaper than in different countries because they are subsidized, the very definition of subsidy. Now, if you have subsidized electricity, there is absolutely no point for you to introduce wind or solar or nuclear or anything like that because it's just economically not valuable. So that they essentially shoot themselves in the foot with these subsidies, right? The question is, why do they have subsidies? Why do they subsidize? And here is sort of, the answer is not very easy, but here we come also to a concept that Alexander mentioned and to which I fully agree, that these countries have it difficult to do some sort of reform which would either eliminate subsidies or introduce low carbon resources. It's been documented for decades, this resource curve, the inability to actually do the change. And it is very often conceptualized as a trap by Paul Collier, or I would say a vicious spiral of resource curves. What it means is that when you have a lot of fossil revenues, you need very strong government capacity to rein them in, to actually not spend them, but to put them in the funds, not to subsidize, etc. But that very capacity is undermined by your revenues. And that means that the more you have revenue, the weaker is the government, the less is the government to actually stop this vicious circle. Now, what can we do to change it? That's the last kind of segment of my, my intervention. Well, one thing, of course, is to start with the subsidies, right? And everybody says, well, you have to reduce the subsidies. In 2009, the governments of G20, they met in Pittsburgh and they decided, that's it, we eliminate the subsidies. This G20 has many, big petrostates, there's Russia, Saudi Arabia and others, and they decided no more subsidies. And they did a fantastic job so that by 2022, subsidies surged by many, many times more than they were in 2009. And there is like, these amounts were projected for 2050. We already passed it, right? Now, so phasing out subsidies turned out to be as difficult as doing other things. Well, but here is another thing, which is probably even more disturbing. We calculated in a model what would happen if you actually remove the subsidies. And that was an article published in Nature. and just bear with me, these are BAU, is business as usual. These are cumulative emissions in the world if you don't do anything, right, by 2050. This is how much we can do for 2 degrees. We can only allow this much. This is for 1.5. Now, if we remove the subsidies, where will we be? Here. This is the effect of subsidy removal, right? So how do all these people say, oh, subsidies are so important? Well, not from economic perspective, because if you remove subsidies, what we subsidize is primarily gas and oil. If we stop subsidizing them, then will be replaced by what? By coal, right? So now that's one effect. Another effect is, imagine Russia removes subsidies. Russian electricity, gas, and gasoline become very expensive. Russian people stop consuming it. Where would it go? It would go directly to Western Europe, where it will be, well, now not to Western Europe, now to China, right? But to international markets, right? Where it will become cheaper. So there will be shift. If you remove it in these regions, there will be shift in subsidies. So anyway, our model shows there is not such a big effect. So it's difficult to do, but probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Plus, there is quite a lot of literature nowadays about political economy of energy subsidies. And we can discuss more in questions and answers, where they go and why it is so difficult to reform. Now, I have 2 more sort of proposals of what to do. One proposal is still like think about our net zero system, which is on the left, as something a little bit more than just driving electric cars or like using solar and wind energy. It's extremely complex system, which requires a lot of different technologies. And some of these technologies are like ideally suited to be placed in these petrostates. So we have to think, what can they do for carbon capture? What can they do for blue hydrogen? What can they do for like biofuels, etc. Finally, we just published an article which asks the question, how can we pay countries to phase out coal? So we did a calculation, because almost always when we phase out coal, and we do it quite a lot in Europe, we pay compensation to companies, workers, regions, etc. Now it's about 200 billion euro committed in this compensation, quite a big sum. So now, and a lot of this is paid internationally. So for example, we have agreements with Vietnam, Indonesia, and South Africa. We tell them, well, if you phase out coal, we will pay you a lot of money to actually do it for climate. Why don't we do it with petrostates? We also do it with this. Maybe that's a good idea, but just to warn you, we calculated what would need to be done if we also offer not only to Vietnam and South Africa, but also to India and China. What about we say to China, we pay you if you phase out coal? They would probably agree, but we don't have such money in the world. There is just not enough money in international climate finance or even ODA to pay any reasonable amount for coal. And I suspect that we won't have money to pay for all either, but that's a good PhD topic. In conclusion, so first of all, petrostate, I don't think that they slow global decarbonization. I think they lag behind in domestic decarbonization, which is important still. That they often do it not because there is poor motivation, but because there is poor capacity. There is this very low government capacity, resource scarce, kind of low prices, etc. And at the center of this problem are probably fossil fuel subsidies in these countries. Well, we don't know, we need a more mechanistic explanation. And then when we propose to do anything with them, we have to think about not in a linear term, we just push, pull, introduce tax, remove tax, but there is actually a vicious circle, that there is a reason, historic reason why they're in this vicious circle. And we have to be super clever how to break out this vicious circle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Aleh. Do we have any questions in the audience? Oh, we have a question. Oh, wait. First, let us give the floor to the audience, and then, please, Sina.
Sorry. Thank you for your presentation. It's a very nice one. The question I will ask is on the issue of fuel subsidy. I know my country is actually guilty of that. All the fuel production for the past, how many years now? 40, 50 years have been subsidized, and it's been a serious issue. And recently the government introduced to scrap and stop subsidy. And later you have huge problem and protest in the country, Nigeria, sorry. So, and I think, like you said, fuel subsidy is a big problem, not only in terms of international or global issue, but even within the country that are engaging in subsidy. But my question is, so what do you think should be the alternative or way forward if this is a problem, not only to the country, but even the global arena? Thank you.
Brought it up. You know, I had a master's student who researched fossil fuel subsidies in Iran. And in around 2010, Iran tried to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies and instead pay, well, like, I mean, the first problem here is that you should understand why these countries have subsidies. They have paid for poor people to avoid social unrest, right? At least that's how they started, because they think we have so much oil revenue, why don't we give some to poor people? And, you know, that's how subsidies are kind of conceptualized. Of course, most of them go to rich people, because rich people drive more cars, you know, use more electricity, more gas. So when you look at this, however, in the budget of people, they take more proportional budget of poor people. So if you remove them, poor people are hurt more, even though they take less subsidies. Now, and Iran discovered it, right? When they tried to remove subsidies, they had a share of rights, a lot of instability. They started to give cash transfers instead. Then there was like, well, you can read this list, it's very complex. At the end of the day, they ended with the same subsidy, it was more emissions, right? Well, and I mean, that's the story kind of goes there. I think that the subsidies, if subsidies are removed, what it can help, and we also say it in this article, didn't have time to say, that actually economies of these countries will change. It will not have a global impact, but within the countries, the economies will change. There will be more renewables, more low carbon, less wasteful consumption, and maybe better government finance even, because they will not need to waste money on subsidies. They can direct them to the poor more directly, right? Not waste them to subsidizing rich people's large cars. But I mean, maybe we have to have a workshop about fossil fuel subsidies in the hub. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Naosuke.
Really fascinating presentation with rich information. My question is actually pretty much the same as the previous question. You know, I understand that subsidy reform, getting rid of subsidies, make a lot of economic sense, and the government can save a lot of subsidy money. But the political scientist part of me is asking, you know, what would be the incentive for the government or petrostates to do that? Because, you know, it's you know, having those subsidies is sort of part of the social welfare package to make sure that people are happy with the government. If you have, you know, cheap oil, cheap gas, cheap electricity, that, you know, that could, you know, increase people's support for the government. But getting rid of that could, you know, trigger sort of grievance against the government. So you could, you know, jeopardize the support for the government. But if they still do that, I wonder what the incentive and then how they perceive the danger of triggering unrest in the countries.
Well, I mean, yes, that's, you know, we started from the same. How do you remove it? What's the benefits? And in a way, there are better ways to help poor people than to subsidize fossil fuels. And if you look like in Europe, and I'm sure in Japan also, and even in North America, we found better ways, right? How to help exactly poor people and exactly what they need, rather than once again subsidizing, you know, gasoline, which rich people can drive their cars more, right? And most of the governments and anyone who went to public policy schools, they know it, and they know how, you know, they can write it, right? The problem is that when you try to, and it would be beneficial for petrostates, because with the same money or with less money, they would actually ideally have less social unrest, because they will not waste money. And we will also have less emissions, and they will have more income from selling this, you know, rather than subsidizing them domestically. So there are all pluses. Why don't they do it? That's a puzzle. And the puzzle, I only have one explanation, that subsidies are easy. The things that we are proposing are difficult. And these governments cannot do difficult things. They can do easy things, right? You just, you know, you're subsidizing this, you know, and therefore it's an issue of their capacity. It's an issue, they cannot even collect taxes, right? That's the whole point of resource curves. And doing all of this complicated, social support requires more skills. So that, yeah, that's a vicious circle.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you.
Introduce myself?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Joldas. I'm a student here at CEU, and also I am from the Hague Research Institute. And so my question is about who must pay for that, like decarbonization, actually. So like the discussions for the COP28, they started this phase out from the fossil fuels, and during the COP29, most likely we will continue discussing the fossil fuel phase out. And the question I think is left is who must do the work, who must pay for the work. So I totally agree. Subsidies are the problem. I agree with that. And as you said, the economies of those countries, they rely heavily on the fossil fuels. And considering the colonial past as well, it is a melting pot of different issues and problems over there. But I'm wondering, like, what is it dependent mostly on? Is it the government who must do the most of the work, or is it international cooperation as well, which is needed, which is like very much needed for the just transition, let's say? Because, for example, those countries who are heavily dependent on the fossil fuels, the economies are heavily dependent on that. They say that it's not fair to demand decarbonization from them right now, because the developed states, they develop thanks to the carbon technologies, to using carbon a lot to develop their economies. So like my question is, who should be like doing the work? Like, should it be petrostate incentivized or the international?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I recommend you have a look at this Nature Communication paper, which we just published on coal, because coal is further along in being phased out. There has been a lot of this discussion, deconstructing of the word must, which you said several times. What does it must mean, right? But basically the agreement on coal is that we first look, how do rich countries do it? How does Germany do it? This is just, right? Just transition in Germany means that you actually pay everyone who loses, workers, companies, and regions. You cannot do in a just democratic society, just kind of, just sweep people's interests aside so that they pay them. Now, the second question is, do we also need to do Chinese coal workers deserve less than German workers, right? Because if you phase it out in China, do they need to reserve the same, right? And probably yes. The answer is yes. Why are they like worse? Then you start calculating, right? And they do it in South Africa, Vietnam, and Indonesia. They apparently treat coal sector in the same way as they treat it in the Czech Republic or Poland, right? If you ask a country to its own detriment to close it, you have to, international community then has to compensate. That's quite established principle in coal, right? The problem is what are technical kind of, as you say, issues arising it. And then eventually the question is that if you ask India or China to do it, you will not have enough money in the world. I mean, you will, but you will need to really, increase international finance to do it. So I think that if you want to look at other fossil fuels, that is a very good template to actually look where it is phased out, how fast it was done, who was receiving compensation, where it actually worked. Not who must do it, because we can have very high moral principles. No, people will simply dismiss them, but how it was actually done in reality, where it was done and what it costs, and then try to replicate these schemes, grow them.
Thank you very much. I think let Andreas speak, and then we will move to a broader discussion, because we want